In the great churning crucible of the 1930s, an age of towering ambition and profound desperation, science was a new religion, and its high priests promised to unlock the very machinery of the soul. They sought to map the mind, to quantify the spirit, to answer the one eternal question that haunts a world of cities and laws. What is a man? Is he a fortress of reason, built brick by language and society? Or is that fortress merely a facade, a thin veneer of civility over a foundation of something much older, much wilder, a thing that sleeps in the dark cathedral of the bones? In the winter of 1931, one man, a brilliant and dangerously arrogant psychologist named Dr. Alistair Finch, decided he would not just ask the question. He would force an answer. He would conduct the most intimate and monstrous experiment of the modern age. Dr. Finch was a titan in the emerging field of behavioral science, a man who saw the human psyche not as a mystery, but as a mechanism to be disassembled and understood. He believed that nurture was a force as powerful as gravity, capable of reshaping nature itself, and he was willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to prove it. His laboratory would not be a sterile university basement, but his own comfortable 3-story home in the suburbs of Florida. His test subjects would not be rats in a maze, but 2 infants, raised in a shared cradle, a shared life, a shared soul. The first was his own newborn son, Donald. The second, arriving just weeks later from a primate research center in Africa, was a baby chimpanzee named Gua. They would be raised as brothers, Finch declared to the scientific world, a groundbreaking, longitudinal study in cross-species development. They would be treated with absolute equality, a control and a variable in a single breathing experiment. The Finch household ceased to be a home. It became a living observation deck, a stage upon which a terrible play was set. Alistair and his wife, Eleanor, were not parents, but lead researchers. Every moment was documented, every reaction quantified. Donald and Gua were dressed in the same blue rompers, fed the same formula from the same bottles, taught to use the toilet in the same way. They were subjected to the same tests of motor skills, of problem solving, of emotional response. The world of academia was fascinated. Finch's early papers were triumphs, detailing the astonishing speed with which Gua began to adopt human behaviors. She learned to respond to her name, to use a spoon, to ask for a drink with a specific, learned sound. She was, for all intents and purposes, becoming a human child. The experiment was hailed as a success, a testament to the limitless power of environment over instinct. For 9 months, the data flowed in one direction. Dr. Finch meticulously documented the ape's remarkable journey towards the light of human reason. He became a celebrity, a man who was seemingly taming the beast not with a whip, but with a lullaby. But in his obsessive focus on the ape's ascent, in his hunger for the results that would prove his grand theory, Alistair Finch failed to document the more subtle and far more terrifying data. He neglected to record the small, almost imperceptible changes in his own son. He did not write down the first time the boy, when reaching for his father's hand, walked not upright, but on his knuckles for a few shuffling steps. He did not note the way his son's laughter began to sound less like a child's joy and more like a panting exhalation. And he did not, under the heading of linguistic development, record the first sound the boy made to ask for food. It was not a word, not a cry, but a short, sharp, guttural bark. A scientific experiment is a controlled conversation with nature, in which the scientist asks a question and, if he is wise, listens humbly to the answer. Dr. Alistair Finch was not a humble man. He was a man who believed he had already written the answer, and he was merely forcing nature to speak it aloud. As the months bled into the first year, nature began to speak, but it was not saying what he wanted to hear. The data, the pure, unbiased record of observation, was becoming corrupted. A horrifying reversal of influence was taking place in the quiet, sun-drenched rooms of his home. Gua, the chimpanzee, was indeed learning. Her progress was methodical, a slow and steady climb. She mastered the fork. She could stack rings. She could communicate a dozen simple needs with specific trained sounds. She was, by all of Finch's metrics, becoming less of an ape. But the terrible, unspoken truth was that Donald was becoming less of a boy. The human child, with his infinitely more plastic mind, proved to be the superior student of mimicry. He learned not from the patient lessons of his parents, but from the constant instinctual behavior of his cradle mate. He learned that the quickest way to get a piece of fruit was not to point, but to emit a sharp, demanding food grunt. He learned that the most effective way to express affection was not with a gentle touch, but with a firm, possessive grooming gesture, his small fingers combing through his mother's hair with an unnerving intensity. While his parents celebrated Gua's first clumsy attempt to scribble with a crayon, they chose to ignore the fact that their own son preferred to paint with his excrement, a behavior he had observed and mastered from his sister in the cage. Dr. Finch, the objective scientist, began to commit the ultimate scientific sin. He started to lie. In his official logs, Donald's increasingly simian behavior were recorded as developmental eccentricities, or transient imitative phases. He wrote of them as minor, temporary data points, statistical noise that would soon be corrected by the overwhelming force of a civilized human environment. But his wife, Eleanor, was not a scientist. She was a mother, and she saw the truth not in data points, but in the growing strangeness in her own son's eyes. She was the one who felt the bite that was a little too hard, a playful nip that was more ape than child. She was the one who would hear two distinct sets of panting, hooting calls from the nursery in the middle of the night and feel a cold dread seep into her heart. Her pleas to Alistair were met with a condescending dismissal, with accusations of maternal anxiety and unscientific sentimentality. The experiment, he assured her, was working perfectly. The boy was merely going through a phase, but a phase has an end. And Donald's behavior was not ending. It was escalating. The great experiment designed to prove the power of a human environment was being corrupted by a simple fact. The environment in the Finch house was no longer exclusively human. The breaking point, the first undeniable crack in Finch's wall of self-deception, came during a visit from a prominent university dean, a man whose funding was essential to the project's future. In the controlled environment of the nursery, Finch put his prize subjects through their paces. He proudly demonstrated how Gua could politely point to a banana on a high shelf. The dean was impressed. Then, the dean turned to Donald, the human child, and with a warm smile, offered him a biscuit from a small tin. Donald looked at the biscuit. He looked at his mother, then at the dean, and let out a full-throated, possessive food bark that echoed in the quiet room. He did not take the offered biscuit. He snatched the entire tin and scrambled, with a speed that was not a toddler's waddle, but an unnervingly fluid quadrupedal motion, under the table. There, in the darkness, he guarded his prize, his panting grunts audible to the horrified guests. The dean's smile vanished. The check was not written. In the devastating silence that followed, Finch saw not the failure of his funding, but the look of utter, soul-crushing defeat on Eleanor's face. The experiment was no longer a success. It was a private disgrace, and it was far from over. The withdrawal of the world's esteem is a kind of death. For Dr. Alistair Finch, the aftermath of the dean's visit was a funeral for his ambition. The letters from the university ceased. The requests for interviews were replaced with whispers of condemnation. His grand experiment, once lauded as a beacon of modern science, was now spoken of in hushed, scornful tones as the Finch folly. In the face of this public disgrace, Finch did not admit defeat. He retreated. He built walls. The house that was once a celebrated laboratory, open to observers and academics, became a fortress of shame. The phone was disconnected. The mail went unanswered. The Finch family, in a move that eerily mirrored the obsessive Puritans and cursed nobles of darker tales, chose an absolute and suffocating isolation. Their new experiment was no longer to prove a theory to the world, but to hide the monstrous results from it. Inside these new walls, the horrifying truth of the experiment's trajectory became undeniable. As the two brothers approached their second and third years, their developmental paths, once parallel, began to diverge with catastrophic speed. Gua, the chimpanzee, reached the hard, unbreachable ceiling of her species. She was a marvel of animal intelligence, a creature who could solve simple puzzles and communicate a score of needs, but she could not grasp the abstract. She could not learn syntax, could not comprehend the future, could not feel empathy. She remained a brilliant ape, a perfect specimen of her kind. Donald, however, did not have such a ceiling. His human mind, designed for limitless learning, continued to absorb the lessons of his environment. But his environment was the cage he shared with Gua. His vocalizations grew more complex, not with words, but with an increasingly nuanced vocabulary of hoots, grunts, and threat barks. He could navigate the house on all fours with a speed and agility that left his bipedal parents struggling to keep up. He was losing the architecture of humanity. It was Eleanor who staged the last, desperate rebellion against her husband's science. She could no longer watch her son slip away. She initiated a new protocol, one born of a mother's terror. She physically separated the children for hours each day. Gua was confined to the nursery, while Eleanor took Donald to the parlor, a human-only sanctum. She surrounded him with the artifacts of a normal childhood, picture books, building blocks, a spinning top. She spoke to him in a constant, gentle stream of words, trying to overwrite the guttural language he had learned. But her efforts were a catastrophic failure. Donald did not see these sessions as an education. He experienced them as a torment. Separated from his true sibling, he would descend into a state of inconsolable panic. He would beat his fists against the floor, let out ear-piercing shrieks of distress, and refuse all food. The moment he was reunited with Gua, he would calm instantly, clinging to the ape's hairy torso, seeking a comfort from the beast that his own mother could no longer provide. The bond was the experiment's most profound and terrible success. Alistair, now no longer a proud scientist but the morbid, obsessive chronicler of his own ruin, watched them with a kind of detached horror. He noted in his private, unpublished logs that the bond was not one of equals. The physically stronger, more assertive chimpanzee had become the dominant figure. Donald was learning his place in a social structure of two. He would offer Gua the choicest pieces of food as a sign of appeasement. He would mimic her threat displays towards his own parents if they approached too quickly. He was learning the rules of the jungle in a suburban home. A child of men becoming a creature of the ape, Eleanor, gaunt and hollow-eyed from months of this private hell, delivered her ultimatum. Her voice, when she finally spoke it, was not hysterical, but cold, with the absolute certainty of a soul that has nothing left to lose. "The experiment is over, Alistair," she stated, standing in the doorway of his study. "The ape leaves this house, or I do, and I am taking my son." The words struck Finch with the force of a physical blow, shattering the last of his scientific justifications. He was faced with the total collapse of his family, the undeniable wreckage of his pride. He looked at the wreckage his ambition had wrought, a wife on the verge of collapse, and a son who was a stranger to his own species. The decision was made. Gua, the chimpanzee who had learned to drink from a teacup, would be returned to the primate center. Alistair and Eleanor clung to the desperate hope that by removing the variable, they could undo the equation, that they could save their son. They did not understand that for Donald, they were not removing a variable from his life. They were amputating a part of his soul. The day they took Gua away was the day that sound died in the Finch house. The event itself was a raw, primal chaos. Donald, seeing the men from the primate center wrap his sister in a net, did not weep or plead. He reacted with the pure, instinctual fury of a wild animal defending its kin. He threw his small, unnervingly strong body at the men, biting, scratching, and letting loose a torrent of high-pitched, terrifying shrieks, a sound that was neither human nor ape, but a pure expression of agony and rage. It took both his father and another man to restrain him as the truck pulled away. He screamed until his throat was raw, his eyes fixed on the empty space where his only sibling had been. It was the last significant vocalization he would ever make. The amputation had been performed. And in the wound, a profound and terrible silence began to grow. Alistair and Eleanor had believed, with the desperate faith of the damned, that removing the ape would allow their son's innate humanity to resurface. They thought the wild behaviors, now without a model to mimic, would simply wither and die, and the human boy, dormant for so long, would finally awaken. They were catastrophically wrong. The behaviors had not been a performance. They were a language, a social architecture. And now, Donald was a society of one, speaking a language no one else understood. The food barks, the grooming gestures, the threat displays, all of it ceased. There was no one to perform them for. But they were not replaced by words or human gestures. They were replaced by a void. The boy, who had been a vibrant, if feral creature, retreated into a deep, near catatonic state of emptiness. He would spend his days sitting in a corner, rocking back and forth with a silent, metronomic rhythm. He ate when food was put in his mouth. He slept when he was laid in his bed. But he did not speak. He did not gesture. He did not connect. The light of awareness in his eyes, which had once burned with a wild animal intelligence, now dimmed to a faint, vacant flicker. The parents, too, became prisoners of this new, silent world. Dr. Alistair Finch's arrogance was not just broken, it was pulverized, ground into a fine dust of guilt that settled on every surface of his life. He locked away his research, his celebrated papers now feeling like indictments for the murder of his own son's soul. He spent his days in a state of obsessive, penitent observation, watching his silent son, writing page after page of new, unpublished notes, no longer the proud documentation of a theory, but the desperate, guilt-ridden confession of a man chronicling the ghost he had created. Eleanor's life became a routine of quiet, sorrowful care for a child who did not seem to recognize her. She was the warden of a gentle prison, her every day a reminder of the boy she had lost, not to death, but to a silence that was somehow worse. For 10 years, the Finch house remained a tomb. The family's isolation became absolute. The world of science forgot them, moving on to newer, less catastrophic studies. But the neighborhood did not forget. The Finch house, with its drawn curtains and overgrown lawn, became a piece of local folklore. Children would dare each other to run up and touch the front door. Delivery drivers spoke of a house that felt empty, yet watched. And on rare occasions, a neighbor would report a glimpse of a pale, thin face in a second-story window. A face that would stare, unblinking for a moment, before vanishing back into the shadows. The failed experiment of Dr. Finch became the local legend of the boy in the window. They assumed he was sick, or mad, or deformed. They whispered, but they kept their distance. The truth, as a social worker who was finally sent to investigate the reclusive family in 1944 would discover, was something far more unsettling. The boy was not a ghost. He was an echo. In the autumn of 1944, a decade after the Finch family had sealed themselves away from the world, a woman named Clara May walked up the cracked and overgrown path to their front door. She was a social worker, a woman accustomed to the quiet tragedies that unfold behind the drawn curtains of suburban homes. She had read the thin file on the Finch case, the old sensational newspaper clippings about a failed experiment, followed by years of vague, concerned reports from neighbors about the silent house and the pale face in the window. She was prepared for sadness, for squalor, for madness. She was not prepared for the profound and orderly stillness of the tomb she was about to enter. Dr. Alistair Finch answered the door. He was a man hollowed out by time and guilt, his once proud posture now a permanent stoop, his eyes holding the dull, polished look of a man who has stared at his own failure for 10,000 days. He did not resist. He let her in with a sigh of grim resignation, as if he had been expecting this visit for years. The house was not dirty. It was a mausoleum. Dust sheets covered the furniture, and stacks of scientific journals and research notes lay on tables like ancient, unread scrolls. The air was cold and stagnant, thick with the scent of old paper, and a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical presence. Clara May interviewed the parents in the dim, curtained parlor. Alistair spoke with a chilling, clinical detachment, narrating the story of his son's decline as if reading from one of his old papers. He spoke of stimulus response, social imprinting, and identity fragmentation. He was a man confessing to a murder, but he could only describe it as a series of biological functions. Eleanor Finch sat beside him, a ghost in a faded dress, saying nothing. Her silence, and the bottomless vacant grief in her eyes, told a truer story than all of her Zban's jargon. After an hour of this chilling history lesson, Clara May asked to see the boy. Alistair Finch nodded and led her up the creaking stairs to a room at the end of the hall. He opened the door not on a scene of horror, but on one of quiet, heartbreaking emptiness. The room was sparse and spotlessly clean. A bed, a chair, a window with a view of the overgrown garden, and sitting in the middle of the floor, rocking with a slow, silent, metronomic rhythm, was Donald. He was a young man now, pale and unnaturally thin, his dark hair falling over his eyes. He did not look up as they entered. He simply continued his silent, endless motion. This was the disturbing truth the house had kept. Not a monster, not a wild animal, but a profound and absolute void. Clara May, trained in the gentle arts of engaging with troubled children, knelt a few feet away from him. "Hello, Donald," she said softly, her voice warm. Donald's rocking stopped. He slowly lifted his head, and for the first time, she saw his face. It was a blank, beautiful, and utterly empty canvas. He looked at her, and then, a fraction of a second later, his lips mimicked the shape of her smile perfectly, but there was no feeling behind it. She tilted her head in a gesture of curiosity. He mirrored the movement with flawless precision. She hummed a single soft note. He repeated it, the pitch identical, but his eyes remained vacant. He was a perfect echo, a living mirror. The experiment had not just stunted his humanity. It had hollowed it out, leaving behind only the most primal neurological function, imitation without a self, a reflection with nothing to cast it. Dr. Finch, his voice raspy with shame, explained his final terrible theory, that by fracturing the boy's social development at its most critical point, he had destroyed the very foundation upon which a human personality is built. He had remachampt of the ape, and in the vacuum, nothing had grown back. In her official report, the social worker recommended immediate institutionalization, citing a developmental pathology the likes of which no textbook had ever described. She called him a child without a self. But it was her final handwritten note in the margins of the case file, a thought she could not bring herself to type, that truly captured the horror of the Finch experiment. "The scientist did not fail to turn an ape into a human," she wrote, her pen scratching in the silence of her office. "He succeeded in turning a human into a ghost. And what does the world do with a ghost that is still breathing?" The social worker's report was a spark in a tinderbox of forgotten rumor and official negligence. The state, finally forced to act upon the whispers that had haunted the Finch property for a decade, moved with a cold and impersonal efficiency. There was no dramatic confrontation. There were no flashing cameras. Just a quiet, gray sedan that pulled up to the house one Tuesday morning, carrying 2 doctors and a court order. The removal of Donald Finch from his home was a scene of profound and sterile sadness. He did not fight. He did not cry out. When the orderlies gently took his arms, he simply went with them, his body passive, his face a blank canvas. He walked out of the house that had been his entire world and into the blinding light of a day he did not comprehend, his eyes reflecting the concerned faces of the strangers around him with a perfect, unnerving clarity. Alistair and Eleanor Finch stood on the porch, two statues of grief, and watched the car pull away. They were now left alone in their silent, self-imposed prison, their living ghost finally exorcised, their life's work now the property of the state. Donald Finch became Case Study 734. He was moved to the Northfield State Institute, a place of advanced psychiatric research where he became the ultimate puzzle for a new generation of scientists. They were men who had read of Finch's infamous experiment in their textbooks, and now, the living result was their patient. They subjected him to every test imaginable, every therapy conceivable. They found a young man with a healthy body, but a mind that was a perfect hollow sphere. He could learn through mimicry with astonishing speed, solving a complex mechanical puzzle after watching a doctor do it once, or repeating a long string of nonsense syllables with perfect pitch. But he originated nothing. He showed no sign of desire, of creativity, of independent thought. He was a creature of pure response, a neurological echo in a human form. The disturbing truth the scientists were forced to confront was that Donald was a testament to a terrifying new idea, that a human self was not an innate, default state. It was a fragile, contingent creation, a structure that had to be built in a critical window of development. And Donald's had never been built. The founders of the experiment faded into obscurity. Dr. Alistair Finch died of a heart attack 2 years after his son was taken, leaving behind a mountain of unpublished notes, a decade of meticulous, soul-crushing observations on the nature of his son's emptiness. His final writings were not of science, but of a desperate philosophical guilt. He had sought to prove that a man could be built from the outside in, and had succeeded only in proving a man could be erased from the inside out. Eleanor lived for 5 more years, selling the house and moving to a small, anonymous apartment, a ghost who never spoke of her son or her husband again. The Finch house, the laboratory of their ruin, was sold, renovated, and its history was slowly scrubbed away by the relentless tide of suburban forgetting. Donald Finch, however, lived on. For 5 decades, he was a resident of the Northfield Institute, his name becoming a quiet legend among the staff. They called him the Mirror Man. They spoke of his unnerving habit of perfectly adopting the posture of a doctor who was speaking to him, or of echoing a tune a nurse was humming under her breath from across the hall. He was a gentle, passive patient, no trouble at all. His only consistent, self-directed activity was discovered by a night orderly. He would find Donald in the common room, sitting on the floor before the dark, reflective screen of the television, rocking back and forth in perfect silent synchronicity with his own reflection. It was the only social interaction his mind could process, a perfect, closed feedback loop between the man and his own empty image. He had found a companion who was his absolute equal. He died of pneumonia at the age of 67, a quiet end to a quiet life. He left behind nothing, no possessions, no letters, no art, no sign that a unique and singular consciousness had ever resided within his skull. The doctors who had studied him for 50 years wrote hundreds of papers, but they all concluded with the same admission of defeat. They could describe the mechanics of his condition, but they could not explain the soul. They could not answer the one, terrifying, fundamental question that Donald's life had posed to the world. When they looked into his vacant, perfectly mirroring eyes, what exactly was looking back? And in his final, quiet moment, as the echo faded and the mirror clouded over, what, if anything, was left to die? The death of Case Study 734 was, in the end, just another data point. After a life of silent observation, Donald Finch's final contribution to the science that had unmade him was his own brain. It was autopsied, sliced into 1,000 translucent slivers, and studied by the best minds of a new generation. They were searching for the scar, for the physical trace of the boy's missing soul, for the neurological evidence of a human identity that had failed to form. They found nothing. His brain was perfectly normal, a healthy, undamaged organ. The ghost they were hunting was not in the tissue. The silence he had lived in had left no physical echo. This final, frustrating lack of evidence became the first line in the story's official epitaph. The Finch Experiment is now a legend in the world of developmental psychology, a foundational, cautionary tale spoken of in hushed tones in university lecture halls. It is the ultimate example of scientific hubris, the dark ghost that haunts the ethical guidelines of all modern human research. Because of Donald, new laws were written, new lines drawn in the sand that could never be crossed. In a tragic and profound sense, the boy who was never able to contribute anything to the world became its unwilling protector. His stolen childhood became the shield that would protect countless others. The scientific world learned its lesson. It put away the tools of such monstrous inquiry and turned to safer, more ethical questions. The case was closed. But a story so fundamental does not end simply because the case is closed. The official explanation is one of a catastrophic failure in social development, a tragic but understandable outcome of a flawed experiment. It is a neat, tidy, and logical conclusion, and it is, perhaps, not the entire truth. The questions that the scientists abandoned still linger in the shadows of the story. Did Dr. Finch merely halt his son's development, leaving a void where a personality was meant to grow? Or did he, in that shared cradle, in that unholy brotherhood, facilitate a terrible and unwanted transference? Did he open a door between two consciousnesses, one human, one animal, and fail to close it? What, precisely, did Gua the chimpanzee learn from her human brother? These are not questions for science. They are the whispers that turn a case study into a modern myth. The story of Donald Finch forces us to confront the fragile architecture of our own minds and ask what exactly holds it all together. What is the ghost in our machine? And how much of what we call a self is truly our own? And how much is merely a reflection of the world we are shown? The final, terrible legacy of the Finch experiment is not a body of data, but a perfect cold reflection. A mirror held up to the world in which humanity, for one terrifying moment, could not find its own image.